Hello and welcome to True Crime with Cam. For today's episode, I've compiled a variety of death row individuals who had some interesting final words right before their execution. On top of that, I'm gonna go into brief detail about what crimes they committed to land themselves on death row. Alright, let's get into it. Gary Gilmore began a life of crime at the age of just 14 when he launched a car theft ring with some friends. He was caught and arrested 3 separate times. After his father's death in 1962, Gary slowly became more and more unhinged. He was in and out of prison for assault and armed robbery until his parole in the spring of 1976. On July 19th of that year, Gary Gilmore robbed a gas station in Orem, Utah. During this, he shot and killed Max Jensen, the lone attendant. The following evening, he robbed a motel in Provo, killing the manager Benny Bushnell in the process. There wasn't a reason for Gary to kill these men. They complied with all of Gary's demands and gave him all the valuables he desired. Despite this, he ordered both of them to lie down before shooting them in the head. Max and Benny were both students at Brigham Young University at the time and left behind wives and children. While disposing of the pistol used in both murders, Gary managed to accidentally shoot himself in the right hand. He then left a blood trail all the way to the garage where his truck was being serviced. The mechanic, Michael Simpson, witnessed Gary hide the gun and create the bloody trail. Michael had heard about the shooting and wrote down Gary's license plate, which he immediately reported to police. Gary then phoned his cousin asking for bandages and painkillers for his injury. Knowing his lengthy history of crimes, she instantly called authorities and turned him in. Utah State Police pulled over and arrested Gary attempting to flee Provo. Although he was charged for both murders, Benny Bushnell's was the only case brought to trial, because apparently there wasn't enough evidence that he did murder Max Jensen. On October 7, 1976, Gary Gilmore was found guilty, and the jury suggested he be punished by execution. At this time, Utah only offered 2 methods of execution: firing squad or hanging. Gary chose the firing squad out of fear that the hanging would be botched. The American Civil Liberties Union granted Gary several stays of execution, which allowed his final day to be pushed back further and further. His response to this was, quote, "They always want to get in on the act. I don't think they have ever really done anything effective in their lives. I would like them all, including that group of reverends and rabbis from Salt Lake City, to butt out. This is my life, and this is my death. It's been sanctioned by the courts that I die, and I accept that." Gary attempted suicide 3 times during his life. The first came after the news of his father's death. The rest came a month apart while waiting for his execution. The night before his execution, Gary had his last meal: a hamburger, hard-boiled eggs, baked potatoes, coffee, and 3 shots of contraband Jack Daniel's whiskey. On January 17, 1977, he was led to an abandoned cannery behind the prison. There, Gary was strapped to a chair in front of a wall of sandbags. 5 local policemen offered to be the executioners. They stood behind the barricade, which displayed 5 small holes where they bore their rifles. 4 of the 5 had real bullets, while 1 was left with a blank. I know it's often a misconception that there's only 1 real bullet and the rest are blanks, but that's not true. There's 4 bullets so that they know for sure that the inmate will be shot and die from their wounds. And still, the volunteers won't know whose bullet actually killed him. When asked for any last words, Gary said, quote, "Let's do it." A black hood was placed over his head just before Reverend Thomas stated, "The Lord be with you." Gary responded, "And with your spirit." And they did this in Latin. Gary's death received nationwide coverage because it was the first execution since the death penalty's reinstatement the prior year. In a Saturday Night Live episode before his execution, the cast sang, quote, "Let's kill Gary Gilmore for Christmas," to the tune of Winter Wonderland. If you're wondering why Gary's last words sound familiar, it's because Nike's slogan is inspired by it. Just do it. Peter Kurten was a German serial killer, often referred to as the Vampire of Dusseldorf. 1888 was the beginning of Peter's descent into wickedness. At the age of 9, he befriended a local dog catcher who was living in the same building as his family. This sick individual would torture and kill the animals he caught, and Peter eventually began to participate as well. 4 years before this, at the age of 5, he allegedly attempted to drown one of his friends. He avenged his failure at 9 years old by drowning 2 of his schoolmates. He pushed one of the schoolmates he knew couldn't swim off of a log raft. When the second boy jumped in to help the first, Peter held his head underwater until he stopped moving. The authorities ruled these deaths an accident. At the age of 13, Peter began performing acts of bestiality with sheep, pigs, and goats at the local stables. And yes, before I started researching Peter Kurten, I thought the word was bestiality. But no, it's bestiality. Peter would also often torture these animals for his additional pleasure. In 1897, he stole all his father's money, as well as all of his employers, and ran off to another city called Koblenz. He was arrested there 1 month later and sentenced to 1 month in jail. Peter's first confirmed murder occurred on May 25, 1913. While breaking into a tavern, he stumbled upon a sleeping 9-year-old girl, Christine Klein. He strangled her to death before slashing her throat twice with his pocket knife. Peter wandered nearby the tavern the next day, just so he could hear the outrage from the locals about the killing. He derived further gratification from hearing their disgust. 2 months later, Peter repeated this act on 17-year-old Gertrude Frankine by manually strangling her as she slept. Luckily, Gertrude managed to survive this attempt. On February 3, 1929, he stabbed an elderly woman with a pair of scissors 24 times. She survived the attack. 5 days later, Peter strangled a 9-year-old girl before stabbing her with scissors in the stomach, head, heart, and genitals. He hid her body beneath a hedge, then lit her corpse on fire. 5 days after this, Peter Kurten killed a 45-year-old mechanic named Flingen by stabbing him a total of 25 times with the same pair of scissors. On August 11th, he lured Maria Han into a meadow after the two had been on a date. Once the two were isolated, he raped, strangled, and stabbed the woman to death. He returned to her body weeks later and buried the remains in a cornfield. 3 months after her burial, Peter confessed to authorities about the murder in an anonymous letter. In the letter, he drew a map which led police directly to her remains. On August 24th, Peter abducted 2 young sisters at a fairground after promising to buy the older ones cigarettes. He strangled and stabbed the 5-year-old and 14-year-old girls to death. After these murders, Peter Kurten decided to switch up his murder weapon to throw off the authorities. From then on, excluding one murder, he opted for a hammer. He raped and bludgeoned 31-year-old Ida and 22-year-old Elizabeth after asking them out for a drink at a cafe. The final murder Peter would commit was on November 7th, 1929. 5-year-old Gertrude was convinced to go on a walk with Peter to an isolated area. He strangled the girl and stabbed her a total of 35 times before disposing of her body in a pile of weeds. 2 days later, a local newspaper received a letter from Peter detailing the location of Maria Han and Gertrude's body. Although Peter attacked and killed various types of people, these letters confirmed to police that these were the acts of one serial killer. Peter Kurten's capture came after a series of strange coincidences. On May 14, 1930, 20-year-old Maria Budlick began walking with an unknown man who offered to help her find employment. When the man tried to lead her through a vacant park, she resisted, and the two began arguing. Peter Kurten overheard this argument and decided to insert himself and look like the good guy. Upon this, the unknown man simply walked off. Peter invited the young woman to his apartment where they ate and drank. He attempted to have sex with Maria, but she rejected his advances. Peter acted like this wasn't a big deal to him and offered to walk her to a hotel. Instead, he led Maria to a wooded area where he attempted to strangle and rape her. Maria began to scream and beg for her life. This is when Peter decided to let her go after she claimed she couldn't remember his address. Maria didn't report this encounter to police, but she did write about the experience to a friend. By some kind of miracle, the letter was addressed incorrectly and opened by a mail clerk on the 19th of May. After reading the contents of this horrifying letter, he turned it in to Dusseldorf police. The chief of police knew that there was a slim possibility that this was the serial killer that had been terrorizing the city. Authorities interviewed Maria, who led them directly to Peter Kurten's apartment. Peter witnessed the police at his door while arriving home and fled to a hostel until he returned home on the 23rd. On this day, he confessed to his wife that he was the vampire of Dusseldorf and urged her to collect the reward for his capture. The next day, Peter's wife led police to their established meeting spot, and Peter was arrested at gunpoint. Peter Kurten confessed to 9 murders, 31 attempted murders, and dozens of petty crimes, including arson and theft. In this statement to the court, he said, quote, "I have no remorse. As to whether recollection of my deeds makes me feel ashamed, I will tell you that thinking back to all the details is not at all unpleasant. I rather enjoy it. On April 22, 1931, Peter Kurten, the vampire of Dusseldorf, was found guilty and sentenced to death. On July 1st, Peter ate his last meal, which was comprised of white wine, Wiener Schnitzel, and fried potatoes. At 6 a.m. the following morning, he was escorted to the guillotine by a psychiatrist and priest. After he placed his neck on the device, he turned to the psychiatrist and said his last words, quote, "After my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." Peter was asked if he had any further words, and he replied no, with a smile on his face. His decapitated head was kept and eventually made its way to the U.S. after World War II, and is now on display at the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum in Wisconsin. On April 9, 1997, 39-year-old Sharon Jackson failed to pick up her coworker friend on her way to work in Huntsville, Texas. Because they had always carpooled, the woman called Sharon's sister out of concern. Sharon's sister went to her apartment and discovered 3 deceased family members: Sharon Jackson and her 2 daughters, 19-year-old Sunny Mays and 18-year-old Erica. The apartment was shared by the deceased and Sharon's husband, James Jackson. At that time, James was only halfway through his 10-year parole. James had previously shot a former girlfriend's father in the face, rendering him permanently deaf in one ear. Luckily, he survived the attempted murder. When authorities arrived to the apartment, they found a handwritten note. It read, quote, "I love Sharon, Sunny, Erica. I could not take care of my family. I didn't have a job. I gave them back to God. He and they will understand." James would later claim that the handwritten note was actually a prayer made weeks earlier in a Bible study folder. One of the prosecutors, Julian Ramirez, responded, quote, "That doesn't make any sense. He had left the note at the crime scene. It was an open and shut case." James's lawyers also stated that Jackson's confession was coerced. Upon questioning, James confessed that he was upset about Sharon's decision to divorce him. When one of the girls arrived home, he asked how she felt about the impending split. She responded that she didn't care either way. The 6'3", 200-pound man then choked her to death with his arm. Upon the other stepdaughter arriving home, he asked her the same question. She said that she loved him and wanted him to stay in her life despite the circumstances. James then manually strangled her to death as well. He placed both of their bodies in their beds and then picked Sharon up from work. When they both arrived home, he tried one last time to reconcile their marriage, which she rejected. James subsequently strangled Sharon, killing her. When James arrived at the apartment the morning after the murders, the police were already there. Once he arrived, he claimed that he had no idea what was going on, and he was asked to go down to the station for questioning. There, he confessed to investigators about his family's murder. He was arrested, charged, and found guilty of the murders on January 28, 1998. The next day, he was sentenced to death. James denied killing his family. He claimed that the day of the killings he had been out all night, gambling and getting high. This contradicted the confession he gave to authorities. On February 7, 2007, James Jackson had his last meal. Fried chicken, fried okra, French fries, salad with blue cheese, hard-boiled eggs with cheese, butter pecan ice cream, 2 honey buns, and 2 Cokes. As James's family members entered to witness his execution, he told them this, quote, "This is not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter. I love you all. See you on the other side." Just before the lethal injection entered his bloodstream, he told the warden, quote, "Warden, murder me. I'm ready to roll. Time to get this party started." That was death row inmates, their last words and last meals. If you like the episode and you want to hear a part 2, make sure you comment down below on this YouTube video. For my podcast listeners, there's a link in the description below. Also, I'd like to know your opinions about the death penalty. Thank you for listening to this episode, and I hope you have a good day, evening, or night. Goodbye.